John Reginald Halliday Christie was born on the 8th of April 1898 in a house on the moors of Yorkshire. He was one of 7 children: Florence, Winnie, Effie, Dolly and Percy. Unfortunately, one sibling died as a baby, so Christie's home life was primarily dominated by women. He himself was a frail child, which seemed to irritate his father Ernest, who it's been said was a very strict disciplinarian. He would shout and beat his son for very minor incidents. Christie's mother was very protective of her sensitive youngest son, and over time he became shy and withdrawn. But at school, where he excelled, he found friends. He relaxed away from his dominating father and gave his mother something to be proud of. She delighted in reading his glowing school reports, and when he won a scholarship to Halifax Secondary School, it became clear Reggie Christie had a high IQ. While Christie was still young, the family moved to Boothtown in Halifax. The house overlooked a cemetery where Christie spent hours playing among the graves. He helped his father in the garden and attended Boy Scouts, a pastime he seemed to enjoy immensely. He enjoyed it so much he would wear his uniform constantly. When Christie was 8, his grandfather, who he was always scared of, died, and he was taken to view the corpse. This was one of a couple of events in his life he couldn't forget. Another unforgettable time for a timid 10-year-old was when he saw his older sister's knee. Let's not forget it was at a time when it was deemed respectable for women to hide as much skin as possible, to be seen as respectable. It was Christie's first introduction to the female's bare body. It left him highly embarrassed. The one major event that would trigger his deep hatred for those of the opposite sex came when, while out with his friends at the age of 15, the group of both girls and boys paired off and headed to Lover's Lane. Christie was uncomfortable and couldn't perform with the girl he had been paired with. She berated him, and somehow word spread, and from then on he suffered constant name-calling and taunts from his peers. His anger simmered as he learned from a child to be quiet and secretive. He let it stew inside. At the age of 18 he joined the army. It was also at this time he began visiting women of the night. This was difficult for Christie. He'd been brought up by respectable parents, always being told to do the right thing by his father, and he knew how disgusted his mother would be if she knew. But here were these women who were not threatening, who would take his money and not judge him. In 1918, Christie's regiment was posted overseas. While in France, a mustard shell exploded close to where he was. It knocked him unconscious. He was returned home, and while in Newcastle Hospital, he lost his voice. Although it's thought to be from the gas, it was actually a condition called functional aphonia, brought on due to fright. Although it was deemed cured a few days later, it affected his voice forever. One of Christie's traits was his voice, his whispering tone, and that's creepy enough. Telling anyone that would listen, he told of his heroic time in the war, how he was gassed and he lost his speech, exaggerating the actual events. He told how the gassing left him without his ability to talk. He also added loss of sight, but that can't be proved. Realising he was getting the sort of attention he enjoyed, he went on to add more and more imaginary conditions to incite sympathy. Christie was demobilised from the army on the 22nd of October 1919. After a short spell in the Royal Air Force, he returned to Halifax. Christie looked for work. He found jobs in a cinema as a film operator. He also worked as a clerk at a wool mill. He wanted to settle down, but now he was home he had no intention of putting himself through the mental torture he had experienced from the women he had once associated with and who had mocked him, even though they were more to his taste. Instead, he met Ethel Simpson, a plain, down-to-earth young woman who was full of kindness. She was smart and thoughtful. He wasn't attracted to her in the intimate sense, but he liked her. She was safe. On May the 10th, 1920, he married Ethel at the Halifax Register Office. Less than a year into the marriage, he'd started to use working girls again and got arrested for theft. He had started work as a postman and stole some postal orders. He got sentenced to 9 months in HMP Manchester. Ethel stood by him. His family didn't. Christie was then convicted on the 15th of January 1923 of obtaining money on false pretences and of violent conduct, for which, respectively, he was bound over and placed on probation for 12 months. Things were spiralling out of control. His use of street workers had become known, and his marriage was on the rocks. Halifax wasn't a comfortable place for Christie to live. Ethel wanted to move to Sheffield to try again for a fresh start, but Christie wasn't having any of it, so he left her with her family and moved on. London. Once there, Christie needed to find work. He managed to scrape by with some clerk or bookkeeping work, but he soon went back to thieving. And he wasn't very good at it. He committed 2 further crimes of larceny during 1924 and received consecutive sentence of 3 and 6 months imprisonment. On the 22nd of September 1924 in HMP Prison, Wandsworth. His life was totally different now, spending nights with street workers and days scraping to make a living. He had no permanent home and mixed with some lowlifes and undesirables. Meanwhile, back in Halifax, Ethel had decided to move to Sheffield with her family. She got a job and lived a stable life. 1929 saw Christie back in prison, serving 6 months hard labour for hitting a working girl, Maud Cole, over the head with a bat. He had been living with her at the time. 1933, he was back inside after stealing a car from a Catholic priest he had become friends with. Some time after this, he and Ethel, who had visited him in prison, renewed their relationship. She seemed happy to go back to the man she married. Unfortunately, it would be a terrible mistake. Christie, it would seem, was just using Ethel, giving him the persona of a respectable, married, hard-working man, where in reality he was leading a double life. When Ethel went away visiting, he went back to his former life, frequenting the red light district. 1938, 10 Rillington Place, where, as we now know, John Christie would show just how dark and depraved he could be. It was the start of all things unholy, where lives would be taken in more ways than one. The old terraced house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. Close by was an underground train station where the noise from trains could be overwhelming. The Christies moved into the downstairs flat in the old deteriorating house that comprised of a living room, bedroom and kitchen. There was no bathroom, only a washroom that had to be accessed from outside, and an outside toilet that all the tenants in the house would use. At the end of the kitchen was an alcove that coal used to be stored in. The bottom flat, their flat, had use of the small rear garden. The flat on the floor above them was similar to theirs, but it was occupied by an elderly man, Charles Kitchener, who kept himself pretty much to himself and was rarely seen. The top floor flat was smaller, more of a bed sitting room and kitchenette. The top flat was empty when the Christies moved in. In 1939, Christie managed, because his records went unchecked, to become a special constable. This opportunity came about due to the force needing people during wartime. He stayed at Harrow Road Police Station for 4 years. His ability to deal with the criminal element earned him commendations. Apparently he revelled in his duties, earning him the nickname Himmler of Rillington Place. Oh Lord. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, this position would also be abused by Christie. The police uniform gave him the ideal cover. He took bribes from the crooks and favours from working girls. The uniform gave comfort to women walking alone, and he knew it, giving him the perfect disguise and excuse to follow them. In the Blitz, it became apparent to him he had a fascination for dead bodies, and the position he was in gave him every opportunity to see them. In 1943, his career was in jeopardy after being caught and beaten by an irate husband of a woman he had started an affair with. His masculinity had once again been bruised. Inwardly, he was mad and raging, boiling mad. August 1943. A young Austrian student nurse, Ruth First, who had started working the streets to supplement her small wage, went to Christie's home. According to Christie, he strangled her with a rope. He then hastily wrapped her leopard print coat around her and placed her body under the floorboards of the front room, cleaning the room quickly before Ethel returned that night. The next day, when Ethel and her visiting brother left, he took the body out, placing it in the wash house while he dug a grave in the garden. That night, Christie crept back into the garden to bury Ruth's body. The next day he told Ethel he was burning rubbish in the garden. This gave him the opportunity to burn Ruth's clothes. Nobody seemed to miss Ruth. Nobody even looked. Christie left the police at the end of 1943 and went to work for Ultra Radio. He became friendly with a female worker, Muriel Eady, a woman of good standing who had a boyfriend. Christie introduced the couple to Ethel, and they all became friends. Christie's devious, depraved mind had already planned the murder of Muriel. Now, while in the police force, Christie had gained a certificate in first aid. He somehow decided this gave him the same qualifications as a doctor. After some time, after gaining Muriel's trust, he carried out his plan. In Ethel's absence, he invited Muriel to the house with the lure of a device he had made to help her with her catarrh, a health problem that had been bothering her for some time. He told her of the device he had made, and she agreed to go to the house to see if it would help. He offered her a cup of tea, then showed her the glass jar he had altered. There were 2 holes in the jar with a rubber tube going into one hole. Muriel sniffed the tube. She could smell the friar's balsam that he'd put in it, but she didn't smell the gas that Christie had fed through the other tube into the jar. Now unconscious, Christie had his way with her, strangling her with a rope in the process. Once again, he dug a grave in the garden and buried Muriel close to Ruth. Christie was pleased with himself. This bold, ageing, unassuming, sickly man had killed 2 women, and nobody suspected him of doing such a terrible thing. After all, he was a respectable, quiet, nice man. Easter of 1948 saw a young, newly married couple, Timothy and Beryl Evans, moving into the top bedsit of 10 Rillington Place. Now, after the war, the whole country struggled and poverty was rife. The small London bedsit was all the Evanses could afford at that time. Timothy Evans was 25 at the time, was a Welsh-born man. Around 1935, his family had moved to London. Timothy hadn't been the healthiest of children and had spent most of his young life in and out of hospitals due to an untreated verruca that had caused him some bigger health problems with his foot. The short time he did attend school, he felt ostracised by the other children. He really did seem to struggle at school. He hated London, so his mother allowed him to return to Wales, where he lived with his grandparents. His outlook changed when returning to Wales. He found the other children were in awe of the boy who had lived in the large city of London. He would make the most of this newfound status, telling them largely exaggerated stories of his life in London. When he left school, he went to work down the mines, but his foot ailments were to end his career. He eventually moved back to London to live with his mum and stepfather. After some failed jobs and struggling to find a decent job with his poor education, he could barely read all right. He landed a job at the toy factory his mother worked at. He was a young man trying to enjoy his life, going out to pubs and spending time with young women. Beryl Thorley was 18 when they met. She came from a respectable family and worked as a telephonist at Grosvenor House, Park Lane. They began seeing each other often and became engaged after a short time. They married on the 20th of September 1947. In 1948, Beryl found out she was pregnant. It was thought best for the couple to move on from the home they had been staying in with relatives, as the home was already overcrowded. Timothy and Beryl liked the Christies, but Thomas's older sister, Eileen, took an instant dislike to Reggie Christie. She saw him creep around silently, and his plimsolls and his low, whispering tone gave her the creeps. But the Evanses were happy with their nicely decorated little home. When they were offered a flat with more amenities in another area, they made the fatal decision of refusing to move. In October 1948, Beryl gave birth to a baby girl they named Geraldine, and they were very happy. Timothy's family doted on the baby and were happy to babysit when Timothy and Beryl went to the pictures once a week. Timothy was a doting dad, Beryl a loving mother. Although Timothy's job as a van driver kept him working long hours, travelling all over the country, he tried to be around as much as he could. But back home, Beryl was seemingly struggling. It's been said Timothy's family noticed the flat was always messy, and the baby, although well looked after, was sometimes unwashed. Rows began to set in as the finances coming in didn't cover the outgoing expenses. Timothy thought Beryl wasn't wise with the small wage of £7 they had coming in from his driving job. The rows became the norm in their rocky relationship. The neighbours would often hear them shouting, and the crashing of objects being thrown around the room could also be heard. Timothy would be locked out of their flat on a couple of occasions, leaving him raging. There were threats bandied around by both parties. These threats would be used against Timothy Evans at trial. When Beryl found out she was pregnant for a second time, she was adamant she didn't want this and was determined to end the pregnancy. We have to say apparently, as it's not really known what happened. Timothy was against this, apparently, but Beryl had made her mind up. Somehow Christie became aware of this. Firstly, he needed to convince the Evanses of his ability to help them. Christie spoke to the gullible Evans, telling him he had been trained as a doctor, and somehow he managed to convince Evans he could perform the operation to help them with their problem. Apparently, when Beryl heard of this, she unfortunately jumped at the offer. It's not entirely known what happened on Tuesday the 8th of November 1949. Apparently, the statement Timothy made at the police station is the version most people have gone by, as Christie's statements have many inconsistencies, so they've been used in conjunction with Evans. Evans woke that morning at his usual time of 6:30. He spent some time with Beryl and his daughter, and before he left, Beryl told him to tell Christie everything was okay, meaning he could go ahead. It would seem Christie went up to see Beryl around lunchtime. She lay on a quilt in front of the fire, as advised by Christie. He fastened a tube to the gas tap, telling Beryl it would make the process less painful. Beryl soon became drowsy. Christie was ready. His desire for this woman kicked in. He straddled her, but Beryl managed to shake him off and struggled with the man who now had the rope in his hands. She wasn't strong enough, and Christie took the life out of her. We have to stress there is no proof of this. After the murder, Christie heard someone on the stairs, then a knock on the door. It was Beryl's friend, Joan Vincent. There was no response, and after trying the door, she realised someone was stopping it from opening. Didn't her friend want to see her? A little hurt, she left, passing Mrs. Christie on her way out. When Evans returned that evening, Christie stopped him, telling him of the bad news. Evans was apparently shocked to the core. He couldn't believe what had happened. He went to the room. She was laying on the bed of the dimly lit room. Christie had covered her with a duvet which hid the marks around her neck. Evans saw she was dead and noticed his daughter in the cot. After some time, a grieving Evans was told by Christie that Beryl's stomach had been septic poisoned. Evans didn't know any better, but he did know that a certain operation that had been performed was illegal. Although Christie would be arrested for manslaughter, Evans knew he would be an accessory, and Christie made a strong point of telling him that. Christie told him they must hide the body. The middle flat was vacant at the time, as the tenant was in hospital, so Christie put the body in there. Christie then went on to tell Evans he would dispose of the body down a drain. Evans was naturally concerned for his baby and wanted to take her to his mother's, but Christie told him it wasn't a good idea, as it would raise questions. The next morning, Christie told Evans he had found a nice couple who would look after his baby daughter. Evans knew he couldn't care for his daughter alone. Although he didn't seem to want to let her go, he felt he had to agree. He packed her belongings. The next day, he was told by Christie, horrifically, not to tell anyone where she or her mother was, just to tell anyone that asked they had gone on holiday to Beryl's father's home. On Thursday the 10th of November, Christie told Evans the couple were coming to fetch the child, so a reluctant Evans kissed his daughter before handing her over to Christie. That morning it's believed Christie went to the Evans' flat and took the child's life with a tie. He then, it's believed, placed her with her mother in a vacant flat. A short while later, a perplexed Joan Vincent went back to see Beryl. She had been worried about her last visit and wanted answers. On arriving, she was apparently stopped by Christie, who told her Beryl had gone to visit her father. Joan noticed, as she peered into the Christie's room through the open door, that Geraldine's pram and high chair were there. She questioned him. He replied he was asked to send them on to Beryl later. After questioning him some more, he got annoyed with her and more or less forced her out the door. Christie needed to get Evans out of the way. He feared he or his family would keep pushing as to where Beryl and the baby were. Evans had been sacked from his driving job. Now Christie had a way of ridding himself of this obstacle. He advised Evans to get rid of all he owned and leave and start afresh somewhere else. On Friday the 11th of November, the construction workers who had been working on the Rillington house had finished the work. They left the area they had been working on clean before they left, they helped the carpenter pull up some old floorboards that were rotten. Meanwhile, Evans went on to tell Joe and Vincent about Beryl's departure. The reason he did this was because Christie had advised him to do so. He then made his way back to Wales to stay with his aunt and uncle. After a while he became desperate to see his daughter. He was rightly worried, and he made the decision to go back and see her. Turning up at Christie's door was a shock to Christie. He told Evans the child would need to settle in, and if he tried to see her it would disturb her. Deflated and worried, he returned to Wales, telling his aunt and uncle Beryl had left him and Geraldine was living with a couple in Reading. After a couple of weeks, a concerned aunt called Evans's mum, asking if she knew Evans was staying with her and what he had said about Beryl and Geraldine. Evans's mother and sister were very concerned, as they knew Beryl wasn't at her father's, as they had telegraphed him earlier. This brought on a heated confrontation between Evans's family members and Christie when they turned up at Rillington Place, looking for answers. Mrs. Christie told them Beryl had left on Tuesday the 8th of November, saying goodbye as she left. But Christie raged that she had left without saying a word. Evans's sister knew one of them was lying. After a very nasty scene with harsh words from Christie about Evans, they left, hurt and angry, threatening police action as they left. Evans's mother was angry and distraught, not knowing what to do. She was also being hounded by people who Evans owed money to. Timothy Evans couldn't cope with the pressure he was now under, and on the 30th of November he walked into Merthyr Tydfil police station to give himself up. Detective Constable Evans looked at Timothy Evans, who told him, "I want to give myself up. I have disposed of my wife." Naturally, a shocked detective warned him to be careful what he said, but Evans replied he knew what he was saying and continued with, "I have put her down a drain. I can't sleep. I want to get it off my chest." The CID got involved and Evans told them a story they found hard to believe. It read, Evans met a man in a cafe that was going to help. He gave him some pills to give her that would get rid of the problem. When she took them, she died. Evans claimed he had carried her body in the early hours outside and put her head down into a drain. He found someone to look after his child and sold his furniture before moving back to Wales. The police called Notting Hill police station straight away, and they went straight round to Rillington Place. They found the manhole outside the Christies and checked the drain. It was empty. When they informed Evans of the news that the drain was empty, he was puzzled. When they told him he wouldn't have managed to lift the manhole cover alone, he realised Christie had lied to him. This is when he finally told them what many believed to be the truth. He told the police of what Christie had done and what he had told him to say to anyone who asked about his wife and daughter, and also the instructions he had advised him to follow. This included what he'd been told that had happened to his daughter. But of course, there was no proof of any murder. The next day, Detective Evans questioned when he last saw his wife's body. Evans explained her body was moved to the vacant flat below, and the detective asked him if he had helped Christie, and Evans replied that Christie had told him to stay in the flat, but he was having trouble moving her down the stairs, so asked him to help. They placed her body in the flat below, and that was the last time he saw his wife's body. Meanwhile, the Notting Hill police visited Evans's mother to find out where Beryl and the child was. She could only tell them what she'd been told by her son and Christie. They then went to 10 Rillington Place. They searched the flat, finding some clippings about a recent murder in a newspaper and a stolen briefcase. They also searched the Christie's place. They didn't check the washroom where Beryl and her baby were buried, nor did they notice any disturbance in the garden where 2 bodies were buried. A huge giveaway would have been the human bone propping up the fence post. Detective Inspector Black and Detective Sergeant Caulfield went to Wales to charge Evans with stealing the briefcase. So Timothy Evans returned with them to London. Christie was also requested to answer some questions at the Notting Hill police station. He was vehement about Evans, telling the police he would never do the things Evans had accused him of. He told them about the rows between Evans and Beryl. He told them his wife could verify all the things that had been said by Evans about his wife, how they could be physically aggressive towards each other. They had known about Beryl trying to rid herself of the baby problem and mentioned to her she looked ill and needed to be looked after. He even mentioned the friend Joan Vincent, who he claimed had inserted herself into the Evanses' problems, making them worse, and how he had noticed Beryl had grown to dislike her. This was backed up by Mrs. Christie. The police now had to find Beryl and the child. Where were they? They knew they weren't at Beryl's father's house. They needed to check 10 Rillington Place again with a more thorough search. Looking through the rooms, they came to the dark and damp washroom. They couldn't see and had to use a torch. There was a stack of wood and planks propped up against the sink. Reaching around the stack, the policeman felt something that felt like cloth. They dragged it out. It was a tablecloth tied up with sash cord. Ethel Christie couldn't identify the rolled up material. She had no idea what it was. Taking the roll outside, they untied it. Beryl's feet were exposed. On further inspection of the wood stack, they found to their horror a smaller roll that contained the little body of Geraldine with the tie still around her. A horrified Evans was shown the bundle of clothes that Beryl was wearing, including the tablecloth and Geraldine's little bundle of clothes. They told Timothy Evans his wife and child had been found. Over 2 days of questioning, he gave his first of 2 statements. He said, "She was incurring one debt after another, and I could not stand it any longer. So I strangled her with a piece of rope and took her down to the flat below, the same night whilst the old man was in hospital. I waited until the Christies were in bed and then took her to the wash house after midnight. This was on Tuesday the 8th of November. He went on Thursday evening, after I came home from work, I took my child's life in the bedroom with my tie, and later that night I took her down to the wash house after the Christies had gone to bed." At a later date, this statement would be shown as false and possibly scripted. He mentioned locking the wash house door tight, but it was apparently impossible to lock it. He had never been in it, so he wouldn't have known this. The bodies couldn't have been there on the 8th, as the workmen who were working on the house were constantly in and out of the wash house. They kept their tools there and cleaned up after they left. The wood the bodies were found behind hadn't been taken up until after the 8th and were not placed there until the 14th, when the carpenter gave the wood to Christie. Although questioned, there was no statement taken from the carpenter at the time. But Evans repeated in a second statement that he had had a violent fit of temper over money while rowing with Beryl, and took some rope he had brought in with him from the van he drove and strangled her. He insisted it was on the 8th of November he had placed the bodies in the wash house. This was substantiated by the Christies, who claimed to have heard some noises coming from the flat above them that night. Evans was held at Brixton Prison leading up to his court date, and the prosecution scraped together as much evidence as they could. Evans's solicitors didn't do a very good job of defending his client. He didn't talk to the workmen, who could have cleared up a lot about the washroom, or talk with the carpenter. He didn't talk to a few witnesses that would have helped this case. He also didn't look into the Christies' past crimes when Evans finally pointed the finger at him. On the 11th of January 1950, Evans went to trial charged with the murder of his daughter and wife. He pleaded not guilty. The prosecution relied heavily on the second statements Evans had made in the Notting Hill police station. Christie was the main witness. He played his part well, telling of the constant violent rows between the couple. When asked about the claims made about him, he told the court he had been suffering from fibrosis on the 8th and couldn't possibly have moved anything that day. He charmed the court with his stories from the war and volunteer policing, leaving the jury with the impression of a decent man. When Evans was called to the stand, he was asked when he first knew of his wife and daughter's death. He said he had first heard at the police station when he was shown the clothes. Asked why he had made the statements, he said he was very upset and believed the police would beat him up. He felt now his wife and daughter were both dead, he had nothing to live for. Under cross-examination, he was made to look like a foolish man who had plenty of motive to kill his wife. The judge, on summing up, had very little sympathy for Evans and showed his admiration for the apparently sickly Christie, who had been injured in the war. On the 13th of January 1950, Timothy Evans was found guilty of the murder of Geraldine Evans and sentenced to death. Leaving the court, Evans's mother and sisters saw Christie and tearfully yelled, "Murderer! Murderer!" Ethel Christie shouted back, "How dare you? He is a good man." Evans would serve his time calmly, waiting for the day he would be hanged, and made sure his family knew he hadn't killed his wife and daughter. Timothy Evans was hung on the 9th of March 1950. After the trial, Christie went into a state of depression. He lost his job when his criminal record was brought to light at the trial, and he heard a few months later that 10 Rillington Place was up for sale. The only people now living in the house was the Christies. His fear of the 2 bodies being discovered by a new owner overwhelmed him. It wouldn't be hard to discover them, as the bones had started to resurface. Muriel Edie's femur had been propping up a fence post for most of the time, and now her skull had appeared. His answer to this was to dispose of it in a bombed-out house. Christie managed to deter some prospective house buyers, but it would be a surveyor's report of bedbug infestation and a long list of decaying areas that put most buyers off, to the relief of Christie. But eventually the house was sold, and new tenants moved in. Christie managed to gain exclusive rights to the use of the garden. By now, the Christies' marriage was in trouble. They were not happy. He felt he needed time away from Ethel, but she wouldn't leave the house. They hadn't got on well with the new tenants, and tensions were rising. By spring 1952, Christie's anxiety had returned. They hated the new tenants. They no longer ruled the roost and became prisoners in their home, constantly under each other's feet. There was little affection for each other now, but Christie's bigger fear of being found out had affected his mental state more than anything else. He spent some time in hospital with a recommendation he spend some time in a mental institution for observation, which he refused, claiming his wife would be afraid to be alone in the house. In December, he would let loose the demon that had been fighting to be let free for some time. He handed in his notice at his job and went home to his wife. That night he strangled her in bed with a stocking. Her body lay in the bed for days before he wrapped her in a blanket, covered her head with a pillowcase, wrapped her in a silk nightgown, and buried her under the floorboards in the front room. His next problem was to make sure Ethel's family didn't suspect anything. So he wrote Christmas cards out claiming Ethel had rheumatism in her hands, so he'd wrote them for her. He was now able to live how he wanted and to do what he needed to do. His wife was gone, but he was struggling financially. He had her wedding ring and sold it. He sold off most of his furniture for a mere £12. He lived in 2 cold rooms with only a mattress, a table and a deck chair. He forged Ethel's signature to claim her savings of £10. And he lived off his unemployment pay of £2.04. But this didn't matter to him. His only need was his desire to be gratified. Ethel's body lay decomposing under the floor. The smell of Jay's fluid lingered in the air as he scrubbed the floor to help disguise the decay. Christie was now in his element. He had no one watching his every move. His pent-up needs burst into a frenzy of killing. He seemed to prey on vulnerable women he could subdue without a fight. Rita Nelson was a Northern Ireland woman living in London. She was apparently a drunk and convicted thief. She was lured back to Christie's rooms, although he claimed she followed him and abused him in the street, but it's believed he lured her there with the promise of helping her when she became pregnant. He followed his usual MO of strangulation with a rope, along with gratification. He then wrapped her up, as he had the others. He pulled out a cupboard in the kitchen and pushed her body inside the alcove. Rita was about 6 months pregnant. She was eventually reported missing by her landlady around the 19th of January 1953. Kathleen Maloney had met Christie in the weeks leading up to Christmas. She and another street worker had spent some time with Christie at his home. He took explicit photos of them and carried out some acts to them both. Kathleen would be another victim of Christie's when she went with him on another occasion. A drunk Kathleen sat in his deck chair. Forcing her to inhale the gas, he once again took her life with a rope, while also committing a act on her. He left her there and went to bed. The next day he wrapped her in the same way he had the others and forced her into the kitchen alcove behind the cupboard. 26-year-old Scottish-born Hectorina McLennan became his next victim. Christie had mentioned he could find her a flat where he lived. Of course, it was just a ploy to get her there. She turned up with her boyfriend, so she was spared that day, but he managed somehow to convince her to visit again. She made the unfortunate decision to go. She was killed in the same way as the others, with Christie's disgusting desires gratified. Christie didn't bother this time to wrap her in a blanket. He just bundled her into the alcove. Hectorina's boyfriend had come looking for her, but Christie managed to convince him he hadn't seen her. Christie's on the run. He had little money now and desperately wanted to go. He fraudulently let his flat to a young couple, Mr. and Mrs. Riley. They gave him £7, 13 shillings in advance, and he took off with a borrowed suitcase. When Charles Brown, the owner of the building, came to collect the rent from Christie, he was surprised to see the new tenants and told them to leave. A young man called Beresford Brown had been living in the flat that Evans had lived in. He'd got permission to use the kitchen connected to Christie's former rooms. He decided to put up some shelves, and while tapping at the wall he realised it sounded hollow, so there must be a room or a cupboard behind the wall that had been concealed. He pulled the wallpaper away and there was a small hole. He grabbed a torch and peered into the dark. He fell back when he saw a naked body. Yelling for help, another neighbour arrived. After he saw for himself what Beresford had seen, they called the police. The police made a thorough search of the house. They removed the bodies of the 3 poor women in the alcove and eventually found Ethel Christie's remains under the floorboards. When the garden was finally looked at, they discovered the remains of First and Edie. A nationwide manhunt for Christie was underway. His face was all over the front pages of newspapers, telling the public to be aware there was a serial killer on the loose. Christie, it would seem, had lost it. He just walked the embankments near Putney Bridge. A police officer, Constable Thomas Ledger, recognised him. Although Christie tried to give a false name, the officer knew it was him. Christie accompanied the police constable in a quiet, submissive manner back to the station. On the 31st of March 1953, Detective Inspector Kelly and Chief Inspector Griffin sat opposite Christie. He began his statement in his quiet, whispering voice, talking about his ill health, mentioning his enteritis, fibrosis and mental health. He claimed he woke up on the morning of the 14th of December to find his wife convulsing in the bed. He said he tried to help her, restoring her breathing, but it didn't help. He then went on with the delusion that he was helping his wife rest by getting her stocking and taking her life. He also tried to make out his wife had tried to unalive herself with his medication. This would be disproved by the coroner. The first person he mentioned in his statement was Rita Nelson, who he said was after his money and had attacked him, so he had to shut her up. Basically, or in his words, he couldn't remember what had happened. He must have lost it, as when he woke the next day she was dead in his deck chair. The rope was a handy thing to have close by, wasn't it? Kathleen Malone, he said, had come to look over the rooms with a view to taking them on from him. According to him, she thought her staying on for a few days would show the landlord she could be a trustworthy tenant. He emphasised the fact he didn't like the thought of that. He tried to make the point that she had offered herself to him as payment towards helping her. Obviously, he took the higher ground and refused. They fought, apparently, but he couldn't remember. He guessed he must have stopped her from fighting him. The next thing he knew, he was putting her in the alcove. Now, Christie, it's been said, was in a state of confusion. His mental health had declined. He'd been living more or less on the streets with little food. But with that in mind, he still claimed self-defence from the 2 women and was adamant he hadn't been involved with ladies of the night or offered help with unwanted pregnancies. And there was no proof that he had performed this procedure on anyone. He claimed, was the victim of violent, unscrupulous women. Hectorina McLennan he described as an accident. She had visited him earlier in the day with her boyfriend, but according to Christie, she returned later on her own and had demanded to stay with him. He had apparently tried to escort her out, but she fell limp. Now, it seems the term fell limp was used by Christie whenever he talked of the women dying. He then claimed to have helped her to the deck chair before putting her in the alcove. While in Brixton prison, Christie changed. He became more aware, more confident. He was now in a routine with regular meals. He seemed to be enjoying the tension he was receiving that sometimes comes along with the tag serial killer. There had been no mention of the death of Beryl Evans, and why would there be? They'd caught the man responsible. At least they thought they had. Until Christie, while talking to a psychiatrist in prison, confessed that it was him who had killed Beryl. But of course he felt really bad about that. On June the 5th his confidence was strong when Kelly and Griffin visited him for a statement on the findings of Ruth First and Muriel Edie in the garden of Rillington Place. On Ruth First he once again put the blame on the woman. She had wanted him to have relations with her. When he found out his wife was due home, he asked her to leave. But he did have relations with her and admitted being responsible for her demise, but always made the excuse that the woman had instigated it, and he had no choice. Muriel Edie had visited Rillington Place at the request of Christie, and for the first time he admitted to using the tube and gas to make her sleepy, and once again couldn't recall all the details but thought he may have had relations with her when he pulled the rope around her neck. Apparently all the women found in the alcove had carbon monoxide present in their blood. Their deaths were due to asphyxia with carbon monoxide poisoning. Marks were found around their necks and semen found inside all but Mrs. Christie. Mrs. Christie had no signs of phenobarbital inside her system, as Christie had claimed she had tried to unalive herself. On the 8th of June, he finally confessed to Kelly and Griffin about the death of Beryl Evans. His version being that Beryl had wanted to end it all because of Timothy Evans, her husband, beating her. So after she had begged him to help her, he'd refused. But later, when going up to her flat and seeing her failed attempt to unalive herself, he decided to carry out her wishes. According to Christie, she had offered relations with him as a thank you, and he admitted to having his way with her when he carried out the deed with the rope. This was one of 4 confessions he made about Beryl's death. He told it differently each time. The claims have often been disputed and discussed, and Christie claimed on more than one occasion that he couldn't be sure if he killed them or not. It's complicated stuff, and it doesn't help that Christie kept changing his story. He would never admit to taking the life of Geraldine Evans, the innocent young child of Beryl and Timothy. He couldn't stand the thought that people would see him as a child killer. In his eyes, he was just the killer of women. Other than that, he was a decent man. While searching Rillington Place, the police found a tin containing pubic hair. They didn't match any of the women, so where did they come from? Nobody knows. Even Christie played dumb. So could there be others? He claimed there could be, but he wasn't sure. Christie had been seen by doctors to ascertain his competence. It became clear to them that Christie seemed to want them to class him as insane, and had been heard mentioning the thought that Broadmoor had appealed to him, as he had heard people there were happy. At the trial, Christie claimed to have killed Beryl, but Timothy Evans had disposed of the body. He claimed insanity for the killing of his wife. The defence would rely heavily on the insanity claim. He admitted 6 other killings, but not Geraldine's. This, they claimed, was to prove the man was mad. Dr. Hobson said that he believed Christie knew what he was doing when he killed Mrs. Christie, but didn't know he was doing wrong. He also believed Christie was suffering with false memories, where his mind would retain certain memories but he couldn't put them in the right place. The Attorney General, Sir Lionel Heald, was adamant that Christie had known exactly what he had done was wrong, as he had hid her under the floorboards and tried to maintain she was still alive to her family by sending Christmas cards signed by him as her, and took her money out of the bank fraudulently. When asked if he would have killed her if a policeman was present, Christie replied no, he wouldn't, showing he obviously knew what was right and wrong. Dr. J.C. Matheson, Principal Medical Officer at Brixton Prison, saw Christie as a weak man who at times tends to exaggerate and act in an hysterical manner. He didn't have hysteria, but would act hysterically in certain circumstances. Psychiatrist Dr. D. Curran said Christie was somewhat emotional but settled down quickly. He was tidy in his person and habits, he kept himself occupied and mixed freely with others. He had been noticeably egocentric and conceited. He kept a photo of himself in the cell. He was a great talker and seemed to enjoy talking about his case. Even if the conversation wasn't about it, he would make sure to turn the conversation back to it. He added, he has a remarkable capacity for dismissing the unpleasant from his mind. The defence urged the jury to bring in a verdict of guilty but insane. The prosecution stated they had proved Christie deliberately killed his wife and knew exactly what he was doing. He stressed that a perversion was not proof of insanity. Justice Finemore spoke, saying just because a man acted like a monster does not mean he is insane. He spoke for a good 2 hours. The jury retired, and about 85 minutes later they returned a verdict of guilty of murder and sentenced to death. On the 15th of July, John Reginald Christie was hanged at Pentonville Prison by Albert Pierpoint. When the rope went around Christie's neck, he said to Albert Pierpoint, "My nose itches." Pierpoint told him not to worry, it wouldn't bother him for long. On the 6th of July 1953, the then Home Secretary set up an inquiry looking into the case of Timothy Evans. As Christie had admitted to the death of Beryl Evans, the convictions of Mr. Evans was deemed unsafe. But the inquiry was held in private. Many people were spoken to, and at the end they still found Evans guilty of killing both his wife and child, and a confession from Christie unreliable and untrue. People were outraged on all sides. The arguments on the Evans case went on, and I guess still does. In 1965, Sir Daniel Brabham, a High Court judge, reheard the case. It took 30 days to cover, and in 1966 the report was published. They found that it was more probable that Evans killed his wife but not his daughter. And because he was charged with the death of his daughter, he was given a pardon. His family were allowed to exhume his body and have it buried in consecrated ground instead of laying in the prison grounds. In January 2003, the Home Office awarded Evans' sister and half-sister compensation for the miscarriage of justice in Evans' trial. For the murder of his daughter was wrongful and a miscarriage of justice. Lord Brennan QC said, "There is no evidence to implicate Timothy Evans for the murder of his wife. She was probably murdered by Christie." But what we do know for sure is Christie killed 6 women, possibly more. Who knows? He had a waxwork figure in Madame Tussauds' now defunct Chamber of Horrors. There are numerous books, films and TV shows based on the case. Christie's demeanour and seemingly emotionless stare was disturbing to those who came across him, and rightly so, as hiding behind his pretentious persona was something far more terrifying.